My name is Patrick Waverly, and 3 months ago I thought I had the perfect marriage. Turns out, I was about as right as a weather forecast in Baltimore, which is to say, completely wrong and headed for disaster. I work as a project manager for a tech consulting firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone drinks too much coffee and pretends to understand blockchain. Diana, my wife of 8 years, works in human resources at Thornton Financial, one of those glass tower companies that make money by moving other people's money around. We had what I thought was a solid relationship built on mutual respect, shared Netflix passwords, and a mortgage we could barely afford. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday evening in September. Diana came home 2 hours late, her hair slightly messed up and her lipstick gone. When I asked about her day, she gave me this bright, artificial smile that looked like it came from a customer service training manual. "Oh, you know how it is," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Brendan needed help with some employee evaluations. We grabbed dinner to discuss the quarterly reviews." Brendan Cole. I knew the name from Diana's work stories. Mid-40s, divorced, the kind of guy who wore expensive suits and drove a BMW he probably couldn't afford. Diana had mentioned him more frequently over the past few months, always in the context of work projects and late meetings. "Brendan again?" I tried to keep my voice casual. "You two have been working together a lot lately." Diana's laugh sounded forced. "He's the senior manager in our department, Patrick. Of course we work together." She disappeared into the bathroom for what felt like an hour-long shower. I stood in our kitchen, staring at the takeout containers from the Thai place she claimed they'd eaten at. The receipt showed 2 meals, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way she'd avoided my kiss when she walked in, or how she'd immediately started talking about needing to do laundry. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Late nights became routine. Diana's phone, which used to sit casually on counters and tables, now stayed glued to her side. She started taking calls in the other room, speaking in hushed tones about work emergencies and client situations. The breaking point came during a family barbecue at my cousin Marcus's house in October. Marcus works in IT support at Thornton Financial. Different department, but same company as Diana. He's one of those guys who knows everyone's business because he fixes their computers and overhears their conversations. "Diana's been putting in some serious overtime," Marcus mentioned while we stood by his grill, flipping burgers and drinking beer. "I see her car in the parking garage all hours." "Yeah, she's been working with that Brendan guy on some big project," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Marcus paused, his beer halfway to his mouth. "Brendan Cole? The guy from HR management? That's the one." "Huh." Marcus looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure he should. "I mean, I'm sure it's just work stuff." But his tone suggested otherwise. There was something in the way he said it, a hesitation that made my stomach tighten. I pressed him for details, but he just shrugged and changed the subject to football. That night, I couldn't sleep. Diana lay beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful while my mind raced through possibilities I didn't want to consider. I found myself studying her face in the dim light from our alarm clock, looking for signs of deception or guilt. She looked the same as always. Dark hair spread across her pillow, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident, the freckles across her nose that had attracted me when we first met. The next morning, Diana left early for another breakfast meeting. I called in sick to work and spent the day doing something I never thought I'd do, going through her things. I felt like a detective in a bad movie, searching for clues while fighting waves of self-disgust. Her laptop was password protected, but I knew Diana well enough to guess it, our wedding anniversary. Inside, I found her email account and started scrolling through recent messages. Most were routine work correspondence, but buried in her sent folder, I discovered a thread with Brendan that made my hands shake. The messages started professional enough, meeting times, project updates, budget discussions. But as I scrolled down to earlier dates, the tone shifted. Inside jokes appeared, then casual comments about personal topics. By August, they were making plans to grab drinks after work to celebrate finishing the Morrison account. The most recent message, sent 3 days ago, made me feel like someone had punched me in the chest. Can't wait for the Christmas party. We should make it memorable this year. His response, "Oh, I plan to. Your husband still planning to attend?" Her reply, "Patrick? Probably. He never misses free food and an open bar." They were talking about me like I was some clueless obstacle to work around. The casual dismissal in Diana's tone, the way she reduced me to a predictable joke, hurt worse than any outright confession would have. I closed the laptop and sat in our living room for an hour, staring at our wedding photos on the mantel. In every picture, Diana looked genuinely happy. Her smile was real, her eyes bright with what I'd believed was love. When had that changed? When had I become the punchline instead of the partner? My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hey, want to grab lunch tomorrow? There's something I think you should know." I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Yes." That evening, Diana came home at her usual late time, full of apologies about traffic and client demands. She kissed my cheek, a quick, perfunctory gesture, and started talking about her day while heating up leftover pasta. "Brendan's been such a help with the year-end evaluations," she said, not noticing how I tensed at his name. "He really knows how to handle difficult situations." I bet he does, I thought, but kept my mouth shut. Instead, I watched my wife of 8 years lie to my face with practiced ease, and I started planning what I was going to do about it. The next day, Marcus and I met at a sports bar downtown, far enough from both our offices to avoid running into colleagues. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his beer coaster and avoiding eye contact. "Look, Patrick, I like Diana," he started. "She's always been good to me, and I know you two have been happy together. But there's some stuff going around the office that I think you should hear." "What kind of stuff?" Marcus sighed heavily. "Brendan Cole's got a reputation. He's been divorced twice, and both times it was because he couldn't keep it in his pants. The guy's a serial cheater, and he's not exactly discreet about it." My stomach dropped, but I kept my expression neutral. "Okay, what does that have to do with Diana?" "People have been talking. Brendan's been bragging to his buddies about his latest conquest. He doesn't mention names, but he keeps talking about stealing another man's woman and how much fun he's having with someone from the HR department." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped my beer bottle tighter and forced myself to speak calmly. "That could be anyone. Patrick, I've seen them together, in the parking garage, in the elevator, at the coffee shop across the street. The way they look at each other, the way they stand too close when they think no one's watching. I'm sorry, man, but I think Diana's having an affair." Hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that finding the emails hadn't. This wasn't just my paranoid imagination or misinterpreted evidence. Someone else had noticed. Someone else had connected the dots. "How long?" I asked quietly. I started noticing things maybe 6 weeks ago, but knowing Brendan, it could have been going on longer. We sat in silence for several minutes, the noise of the bar washing over us. Sports highlights played on the televisions mounted around the room, but I wasn't seeing any of it. My mind was racing, processing this information and trying to figure out what to do with it. "There's something else," Marcus said eventually. "Brendan hangs out with a group of guys from the finance department. They meet for drinks every Friday at Murphy's Pub on Charles Street. He loves having an audience for his stories, if you know what I mean." I looked at my cousin, understanding dawning. "You think he'd talk about Diana in front of his friends?" "I think Brendan Cole can't resist bragging about his conquests. And if someone happened to be recording the conversation—" Marcus shrugged, letting the implication hang in the air. "That's assuming he'd say anything incriminating." "Patrick, this guy's ego is bigger than his BMW. Give him a few drinks and an audience, and he'll tell you things you never wanted to know. Trust me on this." I thought about Diana's casual dismissal of me in her email, The way she and Brendan had discussed me like I was some predictable fool. Maybe it was time to show them how unpredictable I could be. "When's their next get-together?" I asked. Marcus smiled grimly. "Tomorrow night. And I happen to know they're celebrating Brendan's promotion to department head." Perfect. Nothing makes a cheater more talkative than success and alcohol. I spent the rest of the day planning. The idea was simple but required careful execution. I needed to get close enough to record Brendan's conversation without being noticed, and I needed him relaxed enough to brag about his personal life. That evening, I tested my phone's recording app and researched Murphy's Pub online. The place had a typical layout: long bar, scattered tables, dim lighting. If I positioned myself correctly, I could probably capture clear audio from a nearby table. Diana came home late again, full of excitement about some office development. "Brendan got promoted to department head," she announced, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We're all going out tomorrow night to celebrate." "That's nice," I replied, not mentioning that I already knew about both the promotion and the celebration. "You'll probably be home late." "Probably. You don't mind, do you? It's important for office relationships." "I bet it is," I thought. "Of course not. Have fun." She kissed my forehead like I was a child being dismissed, and I wondered if she had any idea what she'd just set in motion. Friday evening arrived with the kind of crisp November air that makes you want to stay inside with a warm drink and a good book. Instead, I found myself walking into Murphy's Pub with a recording app ready on my phone and a stomach full of nervous energy. The place was exactly what I'd expected: dark wood, brass fixtures, and the kind of atmosphere that encouraged people to drink too much and say things they'd regret later. Perfect for my purposes. I spotted Brendan immediately. He was holding court at a corner table, surrounded by 4 other men in expensive suits. Even from across the room, I could hear his loud, confident voice cutting through the ambient noise of the bar. Marcus had arrived 20 minutes earlier and secured a table within earshot of Brendan's group. He gave me a subtle nod as I approached, and I slid into the seat facing away from the target table. "They're already 3 rounds in," Marcus murmured, pretending to study the menu. "Brendan's been talking nonstop about his promotion and how he earned it through superior people skills." I activated my recording app and placed the phone on the table between us, angled toward Brendan's voice. The audio quality would be decent enough, especially if he kept projecting the way he was now. "And that's when I told Richardson that his quarterly numbers were garbage," Brendan was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the space between tables. The man nearly wet himself. These middle managers have no spine whatsoever. His companions laughed appreciatively. I recognized one of them from Diana's office Christmas party last year, a thin guy with premature gray hair who worked in accounts receivable. The others were strangers, but they all had that same polished, aggressive look that seemed to be standard issue in corporate finance. "Speaking of spine," said the gray-haired man, "what's the story with you and that brunette from HR? The married one?" My entire body went rigid. Marcus caught my eye and nodded slightly. This was it. Brendan's laugh was rich and self-satisfied. "Diana? Oh, that's been quite the adventure." Hearing him say my wife's name so casually with such obvious ownership made me want to walk over and introduce his face to the table. Instead, I forced myself to stay still and keep recording. "She's married, right?" asked another voice. 8 years, Brendan confirmed, to some tech guy who thinks he's got her figured out. Poor bastard has no idea what's been happening right under his nose. "How long have you been working on her?" "About 4 months. Started with the usual routine, late meetings, working dinners, the occasional text about work projects. Diana's smart, but she's also bored. Her husband's one of those predictable types who probably thinks romance means remembering to put the toilet seat down." The table erupted in laughter. I gripped my beer bottle so tightly, I was surprised it didn't shatter. "So, you're saying she was easy?" This from a voice I didn't recognize. "Not easy," Brendan corrected. "Eager, there's a difference. Diana's been married to the same guy since she was in her 20s. She never got to explore her options, never got to be with someone who really knows how to handle a woman like her. And you're that someone? Gentlemen, I don't like to brag. Since when? Interrupted the gray-haired man, earning another round of laughter. Fine. I love to brag. Diana Waverly is everything her boring husband isn't giving her. Excitement, passion, a man who knows what he wants and takes it. She told me last week that she hasn't felt this alive in years. I felt like I was going to be sick. The casual way he discussed my wife, the intimate details he was sharing with strangers, the complete lack of respect for either Diana or me, it was worse than I'd imagined. What's the long-term plan? Asked someone. She going to leave her husband? Eventually. Right now, she's worried about the financial mess of a divorce, plus she thinks she still loves the guy. But that's changing. Give it another few months and she'll realize what I already know. She's wasting her life with a man who can't appreciate what he has. You sound pretty confident about that. Brendan's voice took on a smugness that made my skin crawl. Let me put it this way. Her husband thinks she's working late on quarterly evaluations. What she's actually doing is learning things about herself that 8 years of marriage never taught her. The woman is grateful in ways you wouldn't believe. I had heard enough. More than enough. My phone had captured every word, every laugh, every casual dismissal of my marriage and my worth as a husband. But Brendan wasn't finished. The best part is how clueless he is, Brendan continued. Diana says he actually thanked her last week for working so hard to advance her career. The man is so trusting, it's almost pathetic. What happens when he finds out? He won't. And even if he does, what's he going to do about it? Diana's already emotionally checked out of that marriage. She's just going through the motions until she works up the courage to make it official. Still, stealing another man's woman is risky business. Only if you get caught, and only if the other man is worth worrying about. Trust me, Patrick Waverly is not someone who keeps me awake at night. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I'd stopped listening. I had everything I needed and more than I could stomach. Marcus and I finished our drinks in silence, paid our tab, and walked outside into the cold November air. You get it all? Marcus asked once we were safely away from the pub. I checked my phone. 43 minutes of clear audio, including 22 minutes of Brendan's detailed confession about his affair with my wife. Every word. What are you going to do with it? That was the question, wasn't it? I could confront Diana privately, play the recording, and demand an explanation. I could file for divorce and use the evidence in court. I could send copies to Brendan's boss and let his employer handle the situation. Or I could do something that would ensure neither of them forgot the consequences of betraying someone they'd underestimated. The office Christmas party, I said slowly. When is it? December 15th. Why? Diana mentioned it in one of her emails to Brendan. They're planning to make it memorable. Marcus understood immediately. You're thinking of making it memorable in a different way. 300 employees, open bar, and a sound system for speeches and presentations. Brendan loves an audience for his stories. Patrick, that would destroy both their careers. Good. Marcus studied my face in the streetlight. You're serious about this. They think I'm predictable. They think I'm pathetic. They think I'm someone who doesn't deserve respect or consideration. I held up my phone. Time to show them how wrong they are. We parted ways at the parking garage, and I drove home through empty streets, my mind already working on the details. The Christmas party was 3 weeks away, which gave me plenty of time to plan and prepare. I needed to figure out how to access the sound system, when to play the recording for maximum impact, and how to position myself to capture the aftermath. Diana was already in bed when I got home, supposedly exhausted from her celebration dinner with Brendan and the team. She stirred slightly as I slipped under the covers. How was your evening? She asked sleepily. Educational, I replied. She made a soft humming sound and rolled over, pressing her back against my side in a gesture that used to comfort me. Now it felt like a lie, another performance in the elaborate deception she'd been maintaining for months. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to her breathe. Tomorrow I would start planning the most important presentation of my life, and Diana would continue her affair, completely unaware that her predictable husband had just recorded her lover's detailed confession. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Diana thought she was exploring excitement and passion with Brendan Cole, I was planning something that would be far more memorable than anything they'd experienced together. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to prepare for the moment when Diana and Brendan's private affair became very, very public. December 15th arrived with a light snow that made downtown Baltimore look almost magical. The kind of evening that should have been perfect for a romantic Christmas party with my wife, if my wife hadn't been planning to use the event as another opportunity to humiliate me behind my back. I'd spent the previous 3 weeks preparing for this night with the thoroughness of a military operation. The Thornton Financial Christmas party was being held at the Belvedere Hotel, in their main ballroom that could accommodate the company's 350 employees plus guests. Diana had been excited about it for weeks, spending hours shopping for the perfect dress and talking about how important it was for her career to make a good impression. What she didn't know was that her predictable husband had been making preparations of his own. Through Marcus, I'd learned that the hotel's audio-visual setup was handled by a local company called Premier Events. A few phone calls and a modest cash payment had gotten me the contact information for Tommy Rodriguez, the AV technician who would be running sound for the evening. Tommy was a college kid who worked part-time to pay for his communications degree, and he was surprisingly willing to help with what I'd described as a surprise anniversary tribute to my wife. "You want to play a recording during the speech portion of the evening?" Tommy had asked when we met at a coffee shop near campus. "Just a short audio clip," I'd explained. "My wife doesn't know I recorded her talking about how much she loves working at Thornton Financial. I thought it would be a nice surprise during the company presentations." Tommy had grinned at what he thought was a romantic gesture. "That's really sweet, man. Your wife's going to love it." If only he knew. The plan was simple. Richard Thornton, the company's CEO, always gave a speech during the Christmas party, usually around 9 o'clock after dinner and during the peak of the evening's festivities. Tommy would have my audio file loaded and ready to play immediately after Thornton finished his remarks. I'd approach the microphone as if I wanted to add some comments about Diana's dedication to the company, then trigger the playback. The recording I'd prepared was a carefully edited version of Brendan's confession from Murphy's Pub. I'd removed the background noise and enhanced the clarity, but kept every damning word about stealing another man's woman, Diana's gratitude for his attention, and his dismissive comments about her pathetic husband. The audio was crystal clear, unmistakably Brendan's voice, and absolutely devastating. Diana looked stunning that evening. She wore a deep red dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her hair styled in an elegant updo that showed off the diamond earrings I'd given her for our 5th anniversary. She moved through the ballroom with confidence, introducing me to colleagues and laughing at their jokes. To anyone watching, we looked like the perfect couple. "You seem nervous," Diana observed as we found our assigned table. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just not used to these big company events," I replied, which was partially true. "Lot of important people here." "Don't be intimidated. Everyone's really nice once you get to know them." Including Brendan, apparently, who was holding court at a table across the room. He looked exactly like I'd expected. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of artificially white smile that screamed expensive dental work. He wore his success like an expensive cologne, and I could see why Diana had been attracted to his confidence. What I couldn't see was any sign of guilt or concern on either of their faces. They were both playing their parts perfectly, Diana as the devoted wife and Brendan as the friendly colleague. They barely acknowledged each other beyond polite nods and casual hellos, but I caught the subtle glances they exchanged when they thought no one was looking. The evening progressed exactly as I'd anticipated. Cocktails, dinner, the usual corporate small talk about quarterly reports and strategic initiatives. I made conversation with Diana's colleagues, complimented their spouses, and played the role of the supportive husband attending his wife's company function. At 8:30, I excused myself to visit the restroom and made a quick detour to the AV booth. Tommy gave me a thumbs up and showed me the audio file loaded on his system, ready to play at my signal. "Your wife's going to be so surprised," he said with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm counting on it," I replied. By 9 o'clock, the ballroom was at peak energy. The open bar had been flowing for 3 hours, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions. Richard Thornton took the microphone to begin his annual address to the company, a tradition that usually involved thanking employees for their hard work and outlining goals for the coming year. I positioned myself near the front of the room, close enough to reach the microphone quickly, when Thornton finished speaking. Diana was at our table, wine glass in hand, watching her CEO with the attentive expression of someone hoping to make a good impression. Brendan sat with his department colleagues, looking relaxed and confident. He'd had several drinks during dinner and appeared to be enjoying himself immensely. In a few minutes, that would change dramatically. When as we look ahead to the new year, Thornton was saying, "I want to recognize the exceptional dedication of our human resources team, who have worked tirelessly to support our growing organization." Polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Diana smiled and raised her glass slightly in acknowledgement. "In particular," Thornton continued, "I want to thank Diana Waverly and Brendan Cole for their outstanding work on our employee evaluation systems. Their collaboration has been exemplary." More applause. Diana's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the public recognition. Brendan nodded graciously, accepting congratulations from his table mates. Perfect timing. Thornton concluded his remarks and asked if anyone else wanted to address the group. I stepped forward immediately, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Actually, Mr. Thornton, I'd like to say a few words about my wife Diana and her dedication to this company." Surprised murmurs went through the crowd. Diana looked shocked but pleased, probably thinking I was about to deliver some heartfelt tribute to her professional achievements. Thornton handed me the microphone with a smile. "Of course. Everyone, this is Patrick Waverly, Diana's husband." I looked out at the sea of faces, colleagues, executives, support staff, all of them expecting some routine spousal praise. Diana beamed at me from our table, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Thank you," I began. "Diana has indeed been working very hard lately, often staying late to collaborate with colleagues like Brendan Cole. In fact, I recently had the opportunity to hear Brendan discuss their working relationship in detail." I caught Tommy's eye and gave him the signal. He pressed play. Brendan's voice filled the ballroom through the hotel's premium sound system, as clear and unmistakable as if he were speaking directly into the microphone. "Diana? Oh, that's been quite the adventure." The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Every person in the room focused on the speakers with sudden, intense attention. "She's married, right?" 8 years. To some tech guy who thinks he's got her figured out. Poor bastard has no idea what's been happening right under his nose." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 350 people listening to Brendan Cole describe his affair with a colleague's wife in graphic, dismissive detail. I watched Diana's face transform from confusion to recognition to absolute horror as she realized what was happening. Diana's smart, but she's also bored. Her husband's one of those predictable types who probably thinks romance means remembering to put the toilet seat down. Laughter from the recording echoed through the ballroom, but no one in the room was laughing now. Brendan had gone completely pale, his mouth hanging open as he heard his own voice betraying him in front of his entire company. Diana Waverly is everything her boring husband isn't giving her. Excitement, passion, a man who knows what he wants and takes it. She told me last week that she hasn't felt this alive in years. Diana stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She looked around the room desperately, as if searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. Every eye was on her, every ear absorbing the intimate details of her affair. The best part is how clueless he is. Diana says he actually thanked her last week for working so hard to advance her career. The man is so trusting it's almost pathetic. I let the recording continue for another minute, allowing Brendan's voice to fill in every detail of their relationship, every dismissive comment about me, every casual revelation about Diana's dissatisfaction with our marriage. When I finally signaled Tommy to stop the playback, the silence that followed was deafening. I looked directly at Diana, whose face had gone from red to white to green in the span of 3 minutes. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. She'd made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. "I want to thank everyone for listening," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned ballroom. I thought it was important for Diana's colleagues to understand just how dedicated she's been to her work here at Thornton Financial. Then something unexpected happened. Someone in the back of the room started clapping. Slowly, deliberately, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. Others joined in, and within seconds the entire ballroom was applauding, not for Diana or Brendan, but for me. The applause built to a crescendo, accompanied by whistles and calls of approval. I saw Richard Thornton's face cycling through shock, anger, and what might have been grudging respect. Several women in the crowd were nodding approvingly, and more than a few men were raising their glasses in my direction. Diana fled. She pushed through the crowd toward the exit, her red dress a blur of movement as she ran from the room. Brendan tried to follow her, but found his path blocked by colleagues who were suddenly very interested in discussing his collaboration techniques. I handed the microphone back to Thornton and walked calmly toward the exit, accepting handshakes and pats on the back from people who had witnessed the most spectacular public humiliation in Thornton Financial's corporate history. In the hotel lobby, I found Diana sobbing into her phone, probably calling a taxi. She looked up when she saw me approaching, her carefully applied makeup streaked down her face. "Patrick, please, let me explain." "No need," I interrupted. "Brendan already explained everything quite thoroughly." "It's not what you think. It's complicated." "Actually, it's very simple. You've been having an affair with your coworker, lying to me for months, and discussing our marriage like it was some kind of joke. The only complicated part was figuring out how to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person you really are." Diana stared at me as if seeing a stranger. "I never thought you'd do something like this." "That was your mistake. You thought I was predictable." The taxi arrived, and Diana climbed in without another word. Through the window, I watched her give the driver our address, probably planning to pack her things and figure out what came next. I walked back into the ballroom, where the party was resuming with considerably more energy than before. People were talking animatedly, drinks were flowing, and there was an electric atmosphere of shared experience. I'd given them a story they'd be telling for years. Marcus appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses of whiskey. "Well," he said, "that was memorable. Mission accomplished. What happens now?" I looked around the ballroom where Brendan was nowhere to be seen, and Diana's empty chair sat like a monument to poor choices and broken trust. "Now," I said, raising my glass, "I start over." The Monday morning after the Christmas party felt like waking up in a different world. I'd spent the weekend in a hotel downtown, giving Diana space to collect her things from our house and figure out her next move. My phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and texts from friends, family, and even strangers who had somehow gotten my number and wanted to share their thoughts about what they'd witnessed. Marcus had kept me updated on the situation at Thornton Financial through a steady stream of messages. Brendan Cole had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his conduct. Diana had called in sick both Monday and Tuesday, but the rumor mill was working overtime. According to Marcus, the recording had been the only topic of conversation in the office break rooms. "Everyone's calling it the Christmas massacre," he texted me Tuesday afternoon. "HR is having emergency meetings about workplace relationships and professional conduct." I wasn't surprised. What I'd done had been calculated to cause maximum damage to both Diana and Brendan's professional reputations, and it had worked exactly as planned. But I was discovering that revenge, even perfectly executed revenge, came with its own complications. My own office had been buzzing with curiosity since word spread about what had happened. Tech consulting is a small world in Baltimore, and news travels fast. Most of my colleagues were supportive, offering sympathy and admiration for how I'd handled the situation. A few seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of my retaliation, but no one questioned whether Diana and Brendan had deserved it. "You've got brass," my project manager told me during a coffee break. "I'm not sure I would have had the guts to do something that public." "Sometimes public humiliation is the only consequence that matters," I replied. What I didn't tell him was that I wasn't finished yet. Wednesday evening, I drove to our house, my house now technically, since Diana had moved out and was staying with her sister across town. I needed to collect some additional belongings and check on the property, but I also wanted to see if Diana had left anything behind that might be useful for the next phase of my plan. The house felt strange and empty without her presence. Diana had taken most of her clothes and personal items, but she'd left behind our shared belongings, furniture, kitchen appliances, the wedding photos that now seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. I wandered through the rooms we'd shared for 5 years, feeling like an archaeologist examining the remnants of a lost civilization. In her home office, I found what I was looking for. Diana had been careless in her hurry to leave, and her desktop computer was still logged into her personal email account. I spent an hour scrolling through her correspondence, looking for additional evidence of her relationship with Brendan. What I found was worse than I'd expected. The affair had been going on for 6 months, not the 4 that Brendan had mentioned at Murphy's Pub. Diana had been planning to ask me for a divorce after the holidays, but she wanted to wait until she was sure Brendan was serious about their relationship. Most damning of all, she'd been discussing our financial situation with him, including details about my salary, our savings account, and the equity in our house. One email thread from early December made my hands shake with anger. "Brendan, I've been thinking about what you said about Patrick not deserving half of everything we've built together. You're right that he's never been ambitious enough to really contribute to our financial success. When I file for divorce, I want to make sure I protect the assets that I've worked so hard to accumulate." His response was equally infuriating. "Don't worry about Patrick. Men like him don't fight for what they want, which is why they lose it in the first place. By the time this is over, he'll be lucky to keep his car." They'd been planning to destroy me financially as well as emotionally. The affair wasn't just about passion or excitement. It was about Diana repositioning herself for what she saw as a better life, with Brendan's help in minimizing what I'd receive in the divorce settlement. I printed out the entire email thread, along with several other messages that detailed their relationship and their plans for my future. Then I made copies and stored them in multiple locations. If Diana thought she was going to walk away from our marriage with most of our assets, she was about to learn another lesson about underestimating her predictable husband. Thursday morning brought news that Brendan's situation at Thornton Financial had taken a turn for the worse. Marcus called me during lunch with an update that made me smile for the first time in days. "Brendan's been fired," he said without preamble. "Effective immediately." Richard Thornton called an all-hands meeting this morning and announced that the company has zero tolerance for employees who engage in conduct that reflects poorly on the organization. What about Diana? She's been suspended pending investigation. Word is that she'll probably be allowed to resign quietly, but her career at Thornton is over. I felt a surge of satisfaction. The public humiliation at the Christmas party had been just the beginning. Now both Diana and Brendan were facing real consequences for their actions: lost jobs, damaged reputations, and professional relationships that would take years to rebuild if they ever could. But I still wasn't finished. That evening, I drove to Brendan's apartment complex in Federal Hill. I'd gotten his address from the company directory that Marcus had access to, and I wanted to see how he was handling his new circumstances. Brendan lived in one of those upscale developments that charge premium rent for granite countertops and a view of the harbor. His BMW was parked in its assigned spot, but it looked different somehow. As I got closer, I realized why. Someone had keyed deep scratches along both sides of the car, and the windshield had a spider web crack across the passenger side. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who had issues with Brendan Cole. I was walking back to my own car when I heard voices from the apartment building's entrance. Brendan emerged with a woman I didn't recognize, blonde, well-dressed, and clearly angry about something. "Told you this would happen eventually," she was saying. "Your ego finally wrote a check your career couldn't cash. It's temporary, Sarah. I'll find another position within a month." "With what reference? You think Richard Thornton is going to give you a glowing recommendation after what happened at that party?" So this was Sarah, probably Brendan's latest conquest, or maybe an ex-wife. Either way, she didn't seem impressed with his current situation. "Look," Brendan said, his voice taking on the smooth, confident tone I'd heard in the recording. "I know this looks bad, but I can spin it. Diana's husband is clearly unstable. What he did was probably illegal. I can position myself as the victim of a vindictive stalker." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think anyone's going to see you as the victim after hearing that recording? You sounded like exactly what you are, an arrogant cheater who got caught bragging about destroying someone's marriage. Diana wanted out of that marriage anyway. I was just helping her realize what she really needed. What she really needed was someone who wouldn't humiliate her in front of 300 people. Good luck with your job search, Brendan. Don't call me again." Sarah walked away, leaving Brendan standing alone in the parking lot. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing than he had at the Christmas party. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the posture of a man who was beginning to understand the real cost of his choices. I drove home feeling more satisfied than I had since this whole situation began. Brendan was unemployed, his personal relationships were collapsing, and his reputation in Baltimore's finance community was probably beyond repair. Diana was facing her own professional and personal consequences, and the email evidence I'd discovered would ensure that any divorce proceedings went very differently than she'd planned. But there was still one more thing I wanted to do. Friday afternoon, I called Diana's sister Jennifer and asked if I could speak with Diana about some practical matters related to our separation. Jennifer was polite but cool. Clearly, Diana had shared her version of events, which probably painted me as the villain in this story. "She's not ready to talk to you yet, Patrick. Maybe in a few weeks when things have calmed down. I understand she's upset, but we need to discuss the house, our joint accounts, and the divorce proceedings. I'd prefer to handle this civilly rather than through lawyers." There was a long pause. "I'll ask her to call you." Diana called that evening, her voice carefully controlled but shaky around the edges. "Jennifer said you wanted to discuss practical matters." "That's right. I think we should meet in person to talk about how we want to handle the divorce. There are decisions to make about property, finances, all the usual things. I've already consulted with an attorney. He'll be handling everything from my end. That's your choice, but I thought you might want to see some documents I found before you make any final decisions about your legal strategy." Silence. Then, "What documents?" "Email correspondence between you and Brendan about our marriage, our finances, and your plans for the divorce settlement. Very detailed correspondence." Another long silence. When Diana spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Patrick, please, haven't you done enough? I've done exactly as much as necessary. You and Brendan made your choices, and now you're living with the consequences. If you want to discuss this like adults, I'm willing to meet. If you want to handle it through lawyers, that's fine too. but you should know that I have evidence of everything: the affair, the planning, the financial discussions, all of it. Where do you want to meet? Murphy's Pub on Charles Street. Tomorrow at 7. I chose the location deliberately. Murphy's Pub was where Brendan had bragged about stealing another man's woman, where he'd dismissed me as pathetic and predictable. It seemed appropriate that it should also be where Diana learned the final cost of underestimating her husband. Saturday evening, I arrived at Murphy's 15 minutes early and took the same table where Marcus and I had sat 3 weeks ago. The place looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. Diana arrived precisely on time, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual polished professional attire. She looked exhausted, older somehow, as if the events of the past week had aged her years. "Thank you for coming," I said as she sat down across from me. "Do I have a choice?" "You always have choices, Diana. That's what got us into this situation." She ordered a glass of wine, a large one, and waited for me to explain why I'd asked her here. "I found your emails," I said simply. "All of them. The affair, the planning, the discussions about how to minimize what I'd receive in the divorce." Diana's face went pale. "Patrick, I'm not interested in explanations or apologies. I want you to understand that your predictable husband has been several steps ahead of you throughout this entire process. The Christmas party was just the beginning." I pulled out copies of the email correspondence and slid them across the table. Diana read through them with growing horror, probably realizing how damaging they would be in any legal proceeding. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences. You and Brendan thought you could destroy my marriage, humiliate me, and then take most of our assets in the divorce. You thought I was too trusting, too predictable, too pathetic to fight back. I never said you were pathetic. You agreed with Brendan when he said it. You laughed about it in your emails. You planned your entire strategy around the assumption that I wouldn't discover what you were doing or fight for what was mine." Diana stared at the emails, tears forming in her eyes. "I loved you, Patrick. I still love you. This thing with Brendan, it wasn't about not loving you. It was about not respecting me, and respect, it turns out, is more important than love." We sat in silence for several minutes. Around us, Murphy's Pub continued its normal Friday evening routine. Friends sharing drinks, couples on dates, colleagues unwinding after a long week. Normal people living normal lives, not dealing with the wreckage of betrayal and revenge. "So what happens now?" Diana asked. "Now you decide how you want this divorce to proceed. We can handle it quietly and fairly, with both of us walking away with reasonable settlements and minimal legal fees. Or we can do it publicly, with all of this evidence becoming part of the court record and the local legal community getting to read about your affair and your financial planning in detail." "That's blackmail." "No, that's consequences. Blackmail would be if I demanded something I wasn't entitled to. I'm simply offering you a choice between private humiliation and public humiliation." Diana finished her wine and gathered up the email copies. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need. But understand that my offer of a quiet, fair divorce has an expiration date. The longer this drags out, the more interested I become in the public option." She left without another word, and I sat alone at the table where this had all begun, feeling something that might have been peace. The marriage was over, the betrayal had been exposed, and the consequences had been delivered. Diana and Brendan had both learned that their predictable victim was capable of fighting back in ways they'd never imagined. 3 days later, Diana's attorney called mine to discuss settlement terms. The negotiations were brief and reasonable, with Diana accepting a much smaller share of our assets than she'd originally planned. There was no mention of Brendan Cole or workplace affairs or Christmas party recordings. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. I kept the house, most of our savings, and my self-respect. Diana moved to Richmond to take a job with a smaller firm, starting over in a city where nobody knew about her affair or its consequences. Brendan eventually found work with a regional bank in Philadelphia, taking a significant pay cut and a much lower position than he'd held at Thornton Financial. According to Marcus, he'd tried to spin his departure from Baltimore as a voluntary career change, but the finance community is smaller than most people realize, and stories travel. As for me, I learned that being predictable isn't necessarily a weakness, and that underestimating someone can be a costly mistake. Sometimes the quiet husband in the corner is paying more attention than anyone realizes, and sometimes revenge really is a dish best served cold. In front of an audience of 300 people, with perfect audio quality and lasting consequences for everyone involved.